Yeah.
Okay, can everyone at home hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Now I'm going to go into share screen mode, and you guys at home should have no problem whatsoever. It's just the people here who won't be able to see my screen. So can you at home see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Well done.
Yeah, you may as well go home. No, you sit here and you listen, and as Adele says, you take notes.
Yes, ma'am.
Does anybody need paper? I'm ready for every contingency.
So,
I actually found last week that taking notes makes it harder to learn. I
Yeah.
found like I had to listen more and to write less.
That's because you've got also access to the lectures later. If it was a one-off, no other access, you'd be taking notes like crazy
Okay.
and trying to look, listen and everything in one hit. So I think we're
Okay.
spoiled these
Still finding
days.
the balance of what we yeah. I rewatch the lectures. I always rewatch each lecture at least once.
yeah.
Only once, only one.
At least once. Some of them I watched many times because I wasn't paying attention.
Okay, guys. So I'm really, really sorry. But when you rewatch this at home, and for those who have access to a digital device here, you can bring up the PowerPoint and because then at least I can point out the pictures. So we're starting on slide 1, which says ivory. And it's got a picture of some ivory beads that a jeweler brought in to us a couple of years ago. When I say us, I mean where I work in the city. Brought these in saying, what are they? And they had the best examples of what I'd seen in a long time of the characteristic engine turning that is the feature that we look for to identify ivory, and specifically to identify elephant ivory.
Which lesson is this?
This is 19 to 20 organics. And Moodle kind of doesn't put them in numerical order because it starts off with the 2-digit numbers and then reverts to the 1-digit numbers. I've noticed, which is a little bit annoying. So the engine turning in the ivory, when you look at these beads, it's got these parallel lines that run in 2 directions, and there's an approximate angle of about 105 to 110 degrees thereabouts between those two sets of parallel lines that have got that angle between them. So that's the characteristic feature of elephant ivory. Now, ivory, when we think about ivory, most people automatically think about elephant ivory. That's very disconcerting. I just turned around and I went, that's not the picture. It's like, it's snow-capped mountains behind me. So when most people think about ivory, they automatically think about elephant ivory. And this also brings up a lot of emotions with illegal ivory trade and with trying to combat that illegal elephant trade, and some people feel uncomfortable even in handling elephant ivory. I've got some information in the PowerPoint towards the end of the section on ivory that summarizes some of the steps that have been taken to try to restrict the trade in elephant ivory. And there's still a long way to go with getting agreement worldwide on restricting that trade totally. But first of all, we're just going to talk about what ivory is and how we identify it. And then we'll talk a little bit about the in ways in which we can restrict that trade. So anything that is made of teeth can be called ivory. So that's not just elephant ivory, but it also ranges into, well, we've got the fossilized fossilized mammoth ivory, but it also goes into walruses and into shark's teeth, and even into human teeth. So all teeth are made up of the same materials, but it's the elephant ivory that's predominantly being used in jewelry, and it's the elephant ivory that we need to know how to identify. So teeth in general is comprised of a substance that's called dentine. And dentine is a creamy white substance, and it's actually partially crystallized. It's made up of a material called hydroxyapatite, which is the crystalline form of calcium phosphate. But that crystalline form of calcium phosphate, the hydroxyapatite is present in little platelets, and that's interspersed between another material called collagen and combined with water. So dentine is a partially crystalline substance. Covering the dentine is another material called cementum, and cementum is made of essentially the same components as the dentine, but contains a lot more collagen, and that makes it a lot softer and not as suitable to work with as the inner dentine material. Depending upon the type of animal, some animals have an additional third outer layer over their teeth called enamel, which is even more mineralized and is a lot harder material. So human teeth have got the enamel coating. The elephant ivory also has the enamel coating. Before the ivory is worked, the outer enamel coating, which is much thinner, it's not suitable for carving, so that material has to be removed. And they often also remove the cementum material as well. They work only with the inner materials. So elephant tusks, because they are so large, the amount of dentin contained within the elephant tusk is very thick, so it makes it really suitable for carving. And we can carve large items out of an ivory tusk. So it's not just used for jewelry purposes, but it's also used for what's often referred to as the decorative arts or the fine arts, where you get large sculptures. There's also other materials that have been used out of elephant ivory, such as piano keys and, of all things, billiard balls. But elephant ivory has been so widely used within the trade because it's so versatile and so large that most people automatically think about ivory being the elephant ivory. We can also find occasionally the fossilized mammoth ivory, which is essentially the same material as the modern elephants. And it can be really, really difficult to distinguish between the two when they're found in either jewelry or in the decorative arts. There's been a lot of research done into trying to distinguish between the two materials, because there's restrictions being put in place to try to protect modern elephants, whereas the trade in the mammoth ivory, because it's a species that's been extinct for 10,000 years, is seen as not as bad. But they're very, very difficult to separate those two materials. So both the mammoth ivory and the modern elephant ivory are both comprised of the hydroxyapatite and the collagen material in the inner dentin. The modern elephant ivory has got a lot more collagen and a lot more water content, and the mammoth ivory, because it's been fossilized and buried for 10,000 years, has lost a lot of the water content. And so that changes the internal structure of those materials. So there's been a lot of research done using instruments such as scanning electron microscopes, which are very, very expensive equipment, to look at the small scale structure to see the loss of the water and the loss of the collagen and how that changes the structure. With the naked eye, both the mammoth ivory and the elephant ivory can look indistinguishable from each other, and they both have those engine turn lines that we saw in that very first photo. So the tools that we have, the scanning electron microscope, which is not available to us at the Gemological Association. There's only a couple of instruments available within Australia. The modern ivory, because it hasn't lost as much water, it has a very dense structure, and that dense structure is seen at 24,000 times magnification. Whereas the mammoth ivory, that very dense platy structure of the hydroxyapatite starts to break down and appears disorientated at about 10,000 times magnification. So this is just part of the ways in which very sophisticated labs can assist in trying to limit the trade in modern ivories. Modern ivory under standard magnification may appear more compact, and what we mean by that is that it has less fractures or less splinters through the material. The fossilized mammoth ivory, because it has lost water and lost collagen, it may start to show splintery cracks and long channels. But this takes an experienced person to be able to identify some of these features. And the cracks start to appear simply because of the loss of water from the mammoth ivory. There are other instruments that we can use. I've got to let someone in. Sorry about this. I'm just going to admit and then go back and then go from current slide. Okay, so advanced labs have got other instruments available that they can use to try to identify the ivories. One of those instruments is called FTIR, which stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy. And that's basically an advanced form of handheld spectroscope, but it's a digital version and it shows peaks rather than absorption bands against a against the rainbow colors of the visible spectrum. So there's a particular peak number that relates to the water content. So using an FTIR for someone who's trained to use that, they can look to see if that water peak is present, and the height of that peak will give them an idea of how much water is present. So a lower water peak or a lower amount of water suggests that the ivory is significant in age and would be a mammoth ivory. A much higher peak and much higher water content would confirm that the ivory is a lot younger and would have come from a modern elephant. Other tools that we have at our disposal to try to identify the elephant ivory, we can use fluorescence. So because of the water content in the collagen, most ivories will fluoresce a bluish white under long wave and a weaker bluish white under short wave. The mammoth ivory, because it has been fossilized and has lost water over 10,000 years, the mammoth ivory will rarely fluoresce, or if it does fluoresce, will be a lot weaker in fluorescence. And that fluorescence has been attributed to the amount of water content that's present. So with the ivories, we expect to see, with the modern elephant ivories, we expect to see a bluish white fluorescence. Question?
You keep saying modern elephant.
As opposed to the extinct mammoth ivory.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands of years.
Ancient elephant.
So does that mean that there's difference, say, between species of elephant?
There can be differences between the species of elephant, yes.
In
In
ivory
the size of the tusk,
Yeah,
yes.
but not the fairness of it.
That's a little difficult. I've got in a couple of slides, as you can see here, I've gone through as much of the available research in magazines like the Journal of Gemology and Gems in Gemology, with different studies that have been done. Now, RGAA notes state that there is a difference in the angle between the engine turning, that elephant ivory is always greater than 90 degrees and mammoth ivory is always less than 90 degrees. However, there's been other studies that show more of an overlap, and they tend to quote averages rather than exact numbers. And it also depends upon where in that tusk the piece has been cut from. Is it cut from an inner section or is it cut from an outer section? Because these kind of curve and radiate. So the angle changes depending upon where it's cut within the tusk. And then the appearance of the angle also changes depending upon how it's been orientated when it's been cut. So the piece of tusk that's been handed around here, you can see from the cross section that you get those engine turning lines when you're looking perpendicular down the direction of growth of the tusk. So at any other orientation, you're not going to see the full effect of those engine turning lines. And the angles are going to appear to be a different angle if it's cut slightly off orientation. So that gets a little bit complicated. There are some studies that say, yes, you can tell them apart based on their angles, and there are other studies that say, no, you can't tell them apart based on the angles.
But so the mammoth ivory is obviously very old.
Yes.
So it's not easy to just say that's extremely old and this is not. Like
It's
they
not
can't
an
tell.
it's not an
It's
easy
not,
task
no.
to tell them apart.
And so they're just like digging them up like dinosaur bones. And then,
Basically, yes, but it's a much more limited resource compared to potentially live animal
yes,
and
yeah.
all that live trade. Yeah. On the next slide, so I've got a couple of other uses of elephant ivory through the ages. It's been used in inlay work in furniture. So if you go around some of the antique auction rooms, and we're talking really, really high-end furniture that might sell for $5,000 or $10,000 for a mahogany cabinet inlaid with ivory. You get little pieces of inlaid ivory in very high-end furniture of a certain period. You can get ivory, as I said, on pianos. The details that I have in the PowerPoint say that at one stage, the United Kingdom used to make 350,000 pianos a year, all with ivory keys. So when they say tinkling the ivories, meaning play the piano, they're literally ivory keys that the ivory's been used in the keys on the pianos. Not used anymore, but antique pianos will still have the ivory keys.
All elephant?
Sorry, all elephant
Oh,
ivory.
Rhino. I thought.
Rhino's got a different structure and a different color, and it hasn't been used in keys, piano keys. Rhinoceros horns is also heavily restricted, even more so than the elephant ivory. But the materials that the rhinoceros horns have been made out of, so the rhinoceros is a more brown color, a little bit more fibrous structure. We had a
It's
item.
not actually teeth, is it?
It's not teeth, no, it's kind of like hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only reason I asked is I was watching something and they, at some places in Africa, they take them off
Mm,
so that,
to protect the
Yeah,
animal's life,
yeah.
yes. They do the same thing with the elephant tusks
oh,
to
but they're
protect
not
the
used for the same.
elephants. They're not used for the same purpose. The rhino's horns, I've seen antique bowls made out of the rhino's horn and other carved substances, beads and things for necklaces might be made out of it.
And that's not called ivory.
That's not called ivory. No. The billiard balls I find, one of the most wasteful things. You only get 5 billiard balls out of one tusk, one elephant ivory tusk, and because of the force of the collision, the billiard balls are frequently replaced, so they don't last very long. And now they have different materials that they make billiard balls out of. There's a material on the market. Do you want to go and grab the billiard cue out of next door?
The billiard cue.
The billiard, yeah, we got the billiard cue.
You want the imitation stuff as well?
So there's the billiard cue, which is the imitation, and then there's the knife handle.
But this would it depend a lot on the sorry, this is like baffled my brain a little bit.
That's okay.
The nutrients of the animals at the time, would that change the husks? Do you know what I'm saying?
No,
No, it's all the same.
no, it's kind of like our teeth.
Oh yeah, I guess I've always been there.
I feel like I've heard of walrus ivory.
Yes,
Is that?
you will have heard of walrus ivory also, because again, it's a tooth
Oh, yeah.
and it's made of the same hydroxyl apatite and the cementum and the collagen and then the external enamel.
So that can be called ivory.
That is also can be called ivory.
Is it like from whale bone?
Yes. Or the whale tooth. They do scrimshaw on the whale's teeth. So scrimshaw is an art form where they kind of engrave into the surface, but they kind of burnish it a little bit. Yeah, there we go, our billiard cue.
So whale's teeth and whale's bones are ivory.
Yes, because they're all
But-
teeth.
Elephant's bones not ivory.
Oh, sorry, whale tooth, not whale bone.
Oh, wow.
So anything that's a tooth
Okay.
is ivory. So this material here, again, I'm kind of jumping ahead of the PowerPoint a little bit. This material here, for those at home, is sold as a billiards cue to be used in a billiards cue. It is a advanced polymer material that has got two different types of polymer with slightly different hardnesses and slightly different colors that are essentially weaved together with the machine and made into a structure that's got a similar engine turning pattern on the cross section. In some parts, the engine turning pattern is really effective and could fool a lot of people, but then it kind of goes a little bit wonky and it doesn't look very good at all. So that's a billiard cue. We've also got these flat engineered pieces of the same material. Both of these come from AliExpress. That is bought as a billiard cue. This is bought as a knife handle. So for people making their own knives, it's sold as a pair and then it's machined into the shape that you want for the knife handle. It's something else that ivory has been used for in the past, for knife handles. And again, if you hang around the antique auction rooms, you will see complete sets of cutlery with either elephant ivory handles or bone handles. It just kind of depends on how expensive the set was at the time, because the bone has always been the cheaper substitute. So some of the information about the regulation of elephant ivory. The elephant ivory, elephants were listed as an endangered species by the United States in 1976, and there have been laws attempted to be introduced over the last 40 years to try to restrict the trade of elephant ivory. I guess the depressing part is that none of the laws have really gone as far or been as effective as what the regulators have wanted to happen. So it's always a little bit of a fight with a little bit of pushback from other sections of the industry. The laws, don't know what that was. The laws, I'm sure Glenn is more than capable.
No, I'm going to go rescue the boys.
The laws in the UK prevent the sale of any ivory that has been manufactured after the date of 1947. So sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to try to tell the style of a piece to know whether it dates to prior to 1947 or past 1947. So people who are skilled in assessing these types of materials can tell by the style of the carving and the type of images that are displayed as to what date period it belongs to. And just to use a topic that I know a little bit more about, which is cameos, as you go through even decade by decade, the style of the carving of the cameos changes as influenced by the fashions of the period. So hairstyles change, facial features change. You go from a Greco-Roman style nose to a nose that's a little bit more perky over the years and with the turn up. So is it a straight nose or is it a turn up type of nose? You look at the fullness of the cheeks and the jawline. You look at the way that they're dressed and the style of dress, the style of the neckline, and whether there's any other kind of flowers or other attributes. So depending on the subject matter and how it is carved, experts are able to date most materials to within a decade. So the UK tries to prevent the trade of ivory produced since 1947, but allows anything prior to 1947. One of the difficulties in restricting the trade of ivory and some of the arguments that have come up is in things like musical instruments and the movement of musical instruments across borders. So we've already said that elephant ivory has been used in keys of pianos. So one of the issues that came up was with some of the big major concert style grand pianos that are very expensive instruments that travel with the musician. If you restrict the movement of ivories across the borders, that could impact their ability to be able to travel with their instrument. So they try to introduce a law and then someone says, but we need for a different reason. Okay, so Schrager lines. The engine turning can sometimes be referred to as Schrager lines. There's a lady in the UK who's considered an authority on all materials that are used as organics in any form, whether it's in jewellery or as in decorative art. And her name is Maggie Campbell-Peterson. Got it? Okay, and Maggie Campbell-Peterson. She does not like the term Schrager lines, but Schrager lines gets regularly used in other documents. So we kind of use the term interchangeably here. I've tried to use the term engine turning up until this point, but I myself, when I was learning gemology, learnt it as Schrager lines. So it's kind of unlearning your own terminology.
Oh, so it's not sure why.
Not sure why. So the Schrager lines, or that engine turning effect, is not seen in any other forms of ivories other than the elephant ivories, including the mammoth ivory. So those Schrager lines or engine turnings are intersecting chevron patterns, but the angle can change, the appearance or the apparent angle can change depending upon where within the tusk the material's been cut from and the orientation that you're looking at it. It's most visible when it's cut perpendicular to the tusk. So again, if we passed around this tusk here, it is most visible on those edges and not down the side of the tusk. Down the side of the tusk, it may appear just parallel lines, but not the full engine turning. So the convention says that elephant ivory shows intersecting arcs that are never less than 90 degrees, whereas the mammoth ivory is never exceeding 90 degrees. So that's the old convention, but I've got a couple of references to articles within the last 10 years who kind of dispute that a little bit. So there's an article from Gems and Gemology. That's the magazine from the Gemological Institute of America, GIA. So in an article dated 2019, they said that the average angle of the engine turning of the elephant ivory is 109 degrees, whereas the average angle of the mammoth ivory is 69 degrees. Now that fits with our convention of elephant ivory is more than 90 and mammoth ivory is less than 90. RGAA notes say that elephant ivory is greater than 115 degrees, while that mammoth ivory is less than 90 degrees. And just noting that those engine turnings are only seen on the direction perpendicular to the growth of the tusk. If you're looking along parallel to the tusk, you'll see the channels that are parallel and may undulate a little bit. So they have a wavy pattern when you're looking at it along the growth of the elephant tusk. Now, there's an article in Gems and Gemology from 2013 that gave a little bit more detail and statistics and looked at where in the tusk the material had been cut. And it says that elephant ivory can actually range from 65 degrees up to 115 degrees. So, and with an average of 91 degrees. So it says that elephant ivory can be less than 90. It can be as low as 65 degrees. Mammoth ivory ranged from 62 degrees to 105 degrees. So in that article also, they say that mammoth ivory can be greater than 90 degrees, with an average of 87 degrees. So this is what makes it really hard to tell the identification of the ivory just based on the engine turning to conclude whether it is a modern elephant or whether it is a fossilized mammoth ivory. Now, for those sitting in the room, I've taken a picture of a plate that I have at home. And yes, I do own elements of ivory in my collection at home. I've got an Asian carved plate. It's about 15 centimeters diameter, if that, maybe only 10 centimeters diameter. It's got carved dragons on it, and it's got a decorative pierced outer surround. And if you look on the base of the plate, you can quite clearly see the engine turning lines on that plate, which identifies it as a elephant ivory. And this piece of material, I believe to be a modern elephant ivory, not a mammoth ivory. And then on the next slide, I've got a picture of an antique carved rose brooch that's been carved out of ivory. This piece here dates to about 1860 to maybe as late as 1880. And it's a very detailed, very deep carving. It's probably as much as, almost as much as 2 inches deep by about 2 inches wide. So it's like a little block that's about 5 centimeter cube, carved ivory. On this piece of ivory, the carved rose, it's a little bit more difficult to try to identify the engine turning because of how deeply carved the ivory is and the orientation of the carving. So the engine turnings kind of like at the base that you can see on some of the edges of the leaves and the stalk down the bottom. But I didn't capture that in the image. And then I've got a picture of a bracelet, Asian bracelet, but made for the Western tourist trade. And again, an antique piece, probably from about 1890, I think. And that's got little, what's the word that I want to use? Little discs, oval discs that have been carved with flowers. The elephant ivory allows a much finer carving. So you can see the thinness and the fineness of the stalks of these flowers and how they're able to even get underneath the flowers to create that kind of 3D effect. That's something that artisans can only achieve with that elephant ivory. They can't achieve that same result with something like a cow bone. Now, other tests for ivory, tests that we do on normal gemstones may damage an elephant ivory. So things such as refractive index fluid can be quite harmful. So we don't allow refractive index testing of ivory. The textbooks say that a spot RI of between 1.52 and 1.54 is characteristic of the ivory, but we won't be doing any of those tests. But here again, the elephant ivory and the mammoth ivory overlap a lot with those characteristics. Ivory will also absorb water because it is slightly porous. So we already know from our class where we looked at the specific gravity that we don't do any specific gravity tests on materials that are porous, because as they absorb water, it's kind of like a composite material. The water gets into the structure and it affects our actual readings. But the SG of ivory ranges from about 1.69 to 1.81, but these are not tests that we will do. Ivory can also be carbon dated. So as well as looking at the structure under a scanning electron microscope, looking for the water content using FTIR, they can also use carbon dating. So carbon dating is taking the carbon-14 atom, which is slightly radioactive, and measuring the amount of carbon-14 that is present within the structure. All living organisms have a certain amount of carbon-14 present, and the minute the organism stops living, they don't take on board any more carbon-14. And then carbon-14, because it's radioactive, it has what's called a half-life, which is the period of time that it takes for half of the amount of that substance to decay. And decay means, to go under radioactive decay means that it ejects subatomic particles and changes into a different atom, basically. So the carbon-14 takes about 5,500 years for a half-life for half of that material to decay. So if you start off with 10,000 atoms, after 5,500 years you have 5,000 atoms. Another 5,500 years you have half of 5,000, so you have 2,500. And then 2,500 divided by 2 over the next 5,500 years. It takes about 60,000 years for the amount of carbon-14 present to disappear entirely or to go below the limits able to be detected by testing. So advanced labs, and there's only a couple worldwide who can do this form of testing, advanced labs can test for the amount of carbon-14 and tell you with a large amount of accuracy how old the piece of ivory is. And it can tell you whether it was 2 years old, whether the elephant stopped living 2 years ago, or whether it stopped living 15,000 years ago. But that's an expensive test, and it's not performed on pieces of jewellery, but it is a tool that governments have to be able to test ivories that have been confiscated, to try to work out how old they are and whether they're modern elephants or fossilized elephants.
It's destructive, isn't it? You've actually got to take these out.
Correct. Yeah, it is destructive.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understood, but how old were
The mammoths, they went extinct 10,000 years ago. So this is just another test that we have to try to restrict the trade of ivory. Half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. Did you say, is that all?
Is that all?
Is that all? But so because after every 5,700 years, the amount of atoms decreases by half, and then by half again, and then by half again, it takes 60,000 years for it to be below testable limits or detectable limits. And the test takes about 5 to 6 days to perform and is destructive. Okay, additional information on the ban of sales of ivory. USA put forward 2 bills in 2014 to ban the sale of all ivory material, including antiques and any material on the resale market. And that bill would have made it illegal for any private person to own a piece of ivory, even if it had been in their family for generations, even if they hadn't actually bought it, but they had inherited it. That bill did not actually pass, and it was withdrawn. It wasn't put to the vote. So yeah, this is where I said earlier, there are pieces of legislation and laws that are discussed and put forward, and then there's pushback, and they don't go as far as what government agencies may want.
I'm not sure if I told you, but a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to do a safari out in Nairobi.
Yep.
With Masai Mara, and those guys do not muck around with with poachers and so forth. Oh yeah, every park section has like hostile communities, and they're all the guards, and they're armed to the teeth, and they go out and they'll patrol, and they just no prisoners. Yeah, they're very serious. So,
Yeah.
Really good.
The GAA went over to Tanzania in, I think it was 2012. We went to Tanzania as a group trip. I have to admit, we didn't actually have anyone talk to us about poaching. We did stay at like glamping type tent type accommodation. We were protected by guards
And big fences.
and big fences, but they didn't make a big deal, or they didn't talk to us that much about the efforts to protect from poaching.
Yeah.
We went through the Serengeti and saw the wildebeest migration, and we saw a lot of elephants,
Yeah.
but they didn't talk much about the ivory. 2014, I keep pointing at the screen. 2014, the European Union opposed a total global ban on ivory sales, and cities or CITES, international
Trade in endangered species.
There you go, international trade in endangered species. So the EU opposed laws that would have made a total global ban on trading ivory. But the European Union has now banned domestic trade for items acquired after 1990. And I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, acquired after 1990. Does that mean that you can't sell it if you bought it in 1991, but you can sell it if you bought it in 1989? I don't know. In 2016, USA announces a nearly complete ban on export, import, and interstate commercial sale of ivory. However, have exclusions in place for antiques and items that have got minimal ivory content. So something like a piece of furniture with ivory inlay would be considered minimal ivory content, but those types of pieces of furniture are usually antique anyway. When we come to China, in 2017, China announced that all trade in ivory will be illegal as of January 2018. Now, I did this research during COVID when I put together these presentations. So when 2020, and I kind of combed through any available information at the time. I haven't gone back to check, but although China was saying as of 2018, things are going to be illegal, there was limited information on the market to verify whether that had actually happened. Although some of the articles, so the state media in China reported a 65% decline in the price of raw ivory as a result of those bans being implemented. But has it actually been made illegal? I don't know. It said all shops and factories dealing with ivory would close by the end of 2017. I'm not sure if that's actually happened. And in 2018, the UK announced a ban covering ivory items of all ages with few exemptions. In 2019, SSEF and SSEF is the Swiss, yeah, I think it's on the next page that I've got the actual, what SSEF stands for. They announced plans to test for DNA to try to combat the mammoth ivory versus the elephant ivory. Again, because it is so difficult to actually separate the mammoth ivory from the elephant ivory, SSEF's solution is to go for DNA tests rather than carbon dating. And because it's so difficult to tell them apart with the engine turning. So SSEF stands for what's
The Swiss Gemological.
yeah.
Basically.
Yes, Swiss Gemological Institute, but the SSEF, Edelstein Forschung, something
Isn't
like
that the
that.
Swiss version of the GIA?
Yes.
It is. Yeah,
Let's just say that.
let's just say that. Yeah. Now in Australia, there are a couple of auction rooms in Australia, well, more than a couple. Leonard Joel's in Melbourne, long before COVID, I think going back 8 or maybe 10 years, has a blanket ban on handling any ivory products in any form, even in selling musical instruments that contain ivory. Phillips Auction House, which is the other main auction house, does handle ivory, and in almost every auction through Phillips, it is possible to buy ivory products. Up in Sydney, Lawson's Auctions, I know that they handle ivory because I bought a couple of weeks ago an ivory necklace for the GAA teaching collection from Lawson's. So it's up to individual auction houses in Australia as to whether they will handle or resell the material, but we kind of follow the conventions of the UK being pre-1947 and post-1947.
So has the restriction of all this ivory, has it driven the prices up or down?
Driven them down.
Down.
I would definitely say driven them down. A lot of items, well, eBay is another one. You can't sell ivory on eBay, but you can sell ivory on eBay.
Yeah.
You cannot use the word ivory, so most people sell it as cow bone. So we'll have a look in a couple of slides about how to tell the difference between cow bone and ivory. Some people will list a bone item and you look at it and you can see the engine turning and you're like, yeah. And it's about, you know, $10, $20, $50. Some of the really good pieces of ivory, going back a decade or longer, used to get thousands of dollars per piece, and now they'll get hundreds of dollars per piece. And a lot of the auction items, when I track the auction items, don't always sell. And a lot of the really fine pieces of antique carved ivory, there's an area in France, and I'm going to royally stuff up the pronunciation, but Dieppe. Shouldn't have pronounced the E. Dieppe in France used to be a centre for carving ivory, and they did especially very, very fine works back in Georgian Victorian times, and a lot of religious icons, crosses and Christs and things done out of ivory. And you don't see as many of them making it to the market, and they're not the value that they used to be 15 years ago when they do come through. Now, ivory can weather, so it can turn yellow and turn brownish. There's treatments that they can apply to try to make it look brighter, whiter, so they can bleach the material to try to make it look more white. Sometimes the bleach can make the material a little bit more unstable and damage the material. The mammoth ivory can show considerable amounts of weathering, and so can look a lot more brown to begin with, certainly on the exterior. So that's often treated with bleachers to make it look more white. The mammoth ivory, because it contains a lot more cracks in it because of the loss of the water and the collagen, is often treated with polymer impregnation or wax impregnation to try to fill those cracks, and that can actually help it be more durable over time as well. If materials are stained, sometimes some of the modern or the younger ivories are stained to make them look older, so they intentionally make them look a little bit more brown. To identify any stains present requires advanced instrumentation, and we're going to list another type of instrument that I haven't listed tonight, which is Raman spectroscopy, which is different from FTIR. But they're all just advanced pieces of instrumentation. Prices start at $50,000 an instrument and go up, depending on the type of instrument that we're talking about. So it's not inconsiderable amounts of money for these instruments. So the mammoth ivory can be very porous, and they can fill it with polymers to fill the cracks. That will improve the luster of the material. It also improves the durability of the material. And usually any form of polymer impregnation should be able to be identified with a hand lens, because we look for slight differences in the luster. You can see the evidence of the cracks that are present. And sometimes you may be lucky enough to find little gas bubbles trapped in there as well, especially if the polymer that they've used is transparent enough to be able to see through. Okay, so imitants of elephant ivory. One of the most common imitants that has been used is cow bone, which Adele's got a piece to hand around. It has been broken prior to being donated to Gemo, but since being here at Gemo, being handed around by students, I'm sure it's had more little pieces broken off it, so just be really delicate with it. So bone has a very similar composition to ivory, but a considerable difference in structure. So whereas ivory is very, very dense, the bone has got little channels and holes throughout the material, which is where all the blood veins used to be. So the bone was living tissue, and the blood needs to be able to move through the bones. So when we work the bone, depending upon the orientation of the vein compared to the item, if it's cut through the vein, then you'll see little round cross sections and you'll get these little round pinholes through the bone. But if it's cut along the length of the vein, then you'll get these little hollow ridges and channels through the material. So as you look at a piece of bone and you turn it round, you'll get that orientation. In one orientation, you'll see these little pit holes, and in another orientation, you'll see more channels along the edge, and a lack of engine turning. So the elephant ivory doesn't have any blood flow through it, so there are no veins and channels. The bone has the veins. Bone is also more porous than ivory, and it's been suggested that at high levels of magnification with a gemological microscope, so 45 times magnification, it is possible to see the level of porosity with a microscope. Again, we can fill the bone with polymers, so any of those cracks or veins or channels can be filled with polymers. And other identifying features of bone tends to look a lot more whiter than ivory, whereas ivory's got a little bit more of a creamy color. But bone also can darken over time, except for that bit. So the picture that I've got up on the screen is a carved ornament made of bone. And when you look at the base of the bone, it's got these tiny little black short channels, which are the remnants of those blood vessels that have been cut through. Bone is something that is quite frequently encountered. Even a lot of material that is sold as ivory, and anecdotally over the years when I've been looking at antique rooms and auction rooms, there's been material that's been sold as ivory or offered as ivory that is quite clearly bone because it's got the channels there, and vice versa, material that's been sold as bone that's actually ivory. Because sometimes people who handle this material either don't know what they're handling, don't know the features of how to identify it, or they might not necessarily want to admit to what it actually is, which happens on eBay when there's a lot of bone that's not bone on eBay. Other items in addition to cow bone, there's something called vegetable ivory or tagua nuts. Tagua nuts have been known since Egyptian times, so it's a material that's a very ancient material. It's a renewable resource because it's a nut that comes from a tree. Over the years, the tagua nut has been used for things like buttons on clothes. At one point in England, there were 2 million nuts being transformed or being imported into England simply to make buttons. And unfortunately, the trade in tagua nuts for buttons has been replaced by plastic. So I don't know how I necessarily feel about that in this day and age when we know how bad plastics are for the environment. When you've got a nut that is biodegradable and a renewable resource.
Fair trade shops very
Fair
often
trade
have
shops.
jewellery made out of the tagua nut. The colours are
And buttons,
not popular today.
not popular today.
Fair trade shops, if you ever want to come across stuff made out of this.
In the past, tagua nuts have even been used to carve chess pieces out of, and I've been told umbrella handles has been something that has been carved out of tagua nuts. However, the tagua nut is not very big, so you can't make large items out of something that's very small. They're also very difficult to carve, and you can't get the fine detail that you can out of something like an elephant ivory. But they can resemble the elephant ivory in the creamy kind of colour, initially, especially when it's fresh, but they do discolour with age and they do kind of turn brownish or a beige type of colour. So on the screen, we've got a couple of photos of some tagua nuts, including, I know, including an antique sewing needle or embroidery needle carry case that would have been, I want to guess, from the Victorian, well, it does say Victorian sewing needle case. So Victorian period, probably late Victorian period. My gut's telling me 1880s for that carved tagua nut sewing needle case, which has gone slightly beige with age. Buttons are still being produced today, but only for high-end clothes and accessories. You know, we've still got a lot of plastic buttons. They will also, the tagua nuts will also fluoresce a bluish white. So the fluorescence may not be the point of separation from a material made out of tagua nuts rather than the elephant ivory. But it has got a very different structure to the elephant ivory. And there's the lack of the engine turning. And for people who handle these materials, they're very rarely confused.
So you said they'll go a different colour, but they don't break down, like they last fairly well. It's just the colour goes.
They are biodegradable. I don't know over what length of time if they're actually composted, but obviously this picture of the Victorian needle point carrot case, that's 140, 150 years old. And still in good condition, but I don't know if you buried it, how long it would take to break down. Okay, so the plastic materials. So we've handed around the Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the necklace is not a sophisticated reproduction. It's not one of the modern polymers that have been created to really imitate the look of ivory with the engine turning. So 2019, there was a new item that was reported in gemological literature called Avarin Plus, or resin ivory plus S. So 2 different products from 2 different manufacturers. This type of plastic or polymer was introduced specifically to fill the need for ivory in piano keys and ivory in billiard balls and billiard cues. So manufactured in China, 2 different types of polyester with 2 different hardnesses, and they're spun together so that it creates that engine turning effect. And because they've got like 2 different types of polymers, you can actually feel the ridges of the difference over the surface. David chopped up one of the billiard cue and took a slice from the end, and then he cabbed a couple of pieces. He's still got them in his collection. We haven't put them into the lab. I'm going to have to track David down to make them available during class. But he cabbed one of the cross section of the billiard cube, and then he cut it into a smaller section of the section that looked most like the engine turning, and cabbed that. And he thought, even though it was a small piece, there was actually a pretty good imitant of actual ivory, and he thought that most students would be very confused by the 2 materials. So that's with the polymer plastics. I've got a picture on the screen that was taken from I think it's the Journal of Gemology. So the Journal of Gemology is the magazine from the Gemological Association of Great Britain. And they did a little piece on this plastic resin material, and they've got a couple of pieces that they capped, and one piece that they shaped into like a tusk kind of shape, to show the pattern that was achieved through the 2 different polymers. So the Avarin Plus has parallel linear striations along its length. So that's the long piece, that's the billiard cue. You can see the linear striations that are kind of undulating a little bit, and unorganized striations perpendicular to the horizontal plane. And the resin ivory plus S has parallel linear striations along its length and striations with an average angle of 90 degrees perpendicular to the horizontal line plane. Plastics will melt rapidly when touched with a hot point. With some of the materials that we talk about, you may hear us mention a hot point test. So that's basically where you take a needle and you heat it up to be red hot, and then you place that needle against the material that you're wanting to test. And you see if the material melts or if the material burns. And if it burns, you're supposed to smell the material to see what smell it smells like when it's burning.
Oh, if
Yes.
it's real, would it be like burnt hair?
The ivory won't be like burnt hair, but the rhinoceros one will be.
Oh, yes, that was the one that had
So the plastics melt rapidly when touched with a hot point. The hardness of the plastic is 2, hardness of ivory is 4. And the ultraviolet reaction to the plastic will be inert, or should be inert. We could test that. Just wait. That's something that I haven't done. Have you got the, there you go.
Oh, I was going to say, don't strike the convoy. Okay, so it's going to go around.
So we're actually performing a test here to see if the resin from China fluoresces.
That's the resin that
That's-
needs going out.
That's the plastic that's going around.
But that's not the Chinese resin.
No,
That's not, no. But does the other plastic fluoresce?
They all look white and
It just looks really white.
yeah,
It just
they
looks
just
really
all look white. I tried on the other stuff before.
Yeah.
I didn't piss in UV, but it's just right.
Okay. With the other pieces of ivory, whoever's got them.
Next door.
Oh, you put them all next door. Oh, that's good. I was going to suggest we could test it with the UV. Nah.
They keep locking me out.
Do they? Oh dear. Okay, has anyone got any questions on the ivory?
I'm just curious about the those nuts.
Tagua nuts?
Yeah, so is it naturally that hard? Like, what is that? Is that the nut? It's the actual nut inside the
It's
nut
the actual nuts,
is
yes,
already naturally that hard.
yes,
Crazy.
yeah.
And somebody tested it.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Huh.
Is it type of wood? Like we call it the vegetable ivory. Does it act like wood does? Do you know what I mean?
No, it's actually a nut. I don't think it's an edible nut, but it's a nut, like a macadamia nut or.
No, it's not.
I wonder how macadamia nuts age.
Have you guys ever tried to open a macadamia nut?
Oh, God, yeah.
I got a hole through the roof and I opened one. Smack so
No.
That is,
Was it worth it? Did you
no,
just remember?
and I couldn't open it.
Yeah, if you're buying a bag of macadamia, make sure they're big shelled.
So just to confirm, so the plastic like will melt obviously and the real ivory just kind of burns.
Not sure what the hot point test on the real ivory is. I just know that the plastic burns. Hot point tests are considered destructive tests. So like when we come to talk about things like the tortoiseshell, we talk about the hot point test. Don't really do a hot point test.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
If you are going to do a hot point test, you need to do it in a conspicuous area, inconspicuous area. Someplace that is not easily seen. And ask permission if it's not your item.
Yeah.
And if it is your item, go for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, the next topic that we're going to talk about is Whitby jet. So Whitby jet is another type of material that is an organic material that has been used in jewellery. It's a material that is still currently available and worked on today. If you go to Whitby in the UK, you can still buy Whitby jet items, although they are not as popular today as they used to be, and they're not making them in the same volumes as they used to be. The Whitby jet items, Whitby jet is a material that is very dense, very lustrous and very black. And it came into great prominence in the Victorian period when Prince Albert died at a very young age and Queen Victoria was devastated and the whole country went into mourning and Queen Victoria wore black. Everyone else had to wear black as well. So a lot of people wore black jewellery when Prince Albert died, but also a lot of people would wear mourning jewellery when their own relatives died. It's not something that we do so much these days, but you find a lot of antique jewellery on the second-hand market, mourning jewellery that was either Whitby jet, if you had the money for Whitby jet, or there were cheaper alternatives, which included bog oak and gutta percha. So we're going to talk about these materials and how we might be able to try to separate them. And Adele's just brought in the Whitby jet earring, single earring, not a pair of earrings.
No findings.
No findings. It's slightly broken, which is how the GAA came to acquire it, because they broke from the fittings and
You'll explain why.
yeah,
So light. It's
very light, very light.
It's like-
So for those who cannot see the screen, I've got a photograph of 3 carved cameos carved out of Whitby jet with various scenes on them.
I do very quick question about those.
Yes.
Are they, they're mourning, there are people who pass away? Or
No.
that sometimes they just do them decoratively?
So the one on the, when I'm looking at the screen on the left-hand side with the flowers in her hair, that's Flora.
Yeah.
Goddess Flora.
Oh,
The one in the center,
looks like a lead, a soldier.
the woman behind from my screen looks like she's wearing got a half moon crescent in her hair. If it's a half moon crescent, that means it's the goddess Diana or Artemis, depending upon whether you're using the Roman name or the Greek name.
Yeah.
Goddess of the hunt, and also the deity that's responsible for taking the moon across the sky at night in her chariot. She drags the moon across the sky, which is why she's got a half moon. She's sometimes depicted with her brother Apollo, who drags the sun across the sky during the day. So it looks like the gentleman at the front might have sun rays coming out of his head that might indicate he's Apollo. So these are Greek or Roman deities. The gentleman on the other side, he is not a Roman or a Greek god, and he would be either someone prominent in society. So just like you can buy statues of things like Mozart, he might have been someone prominent at the time. Or if it was a very wealthy family, they may have commissioned someone's portrait for mourning purposes. So it's not always possible to identify all of the figures that have been carved into things like cameos, but there are some notable faces that are, quite recognizable. And then a lot of the Greek and Roman scenes with the Greek gods and the Roman gods are quite recognizable. And there's textbooks that have been written on these types of jewelry and the motifs and who these people are and how you recognize them. So Whitby Jet, there's a 40-year period during the mid to late 19th century, so that's 1800s, that's thought of as the heyday of Whitby Jet manufacture. And that's because of the death of Prince Albert and the mourning jewellery that the Victorians used to manufacture and used to wear quite prolifically. However, the Whitby Jet production of materials dates back much, much earlier than that. And the trade in Whitby Jet actually extends back 4,500 years to the time of the Romans. And it has been suggested that the trade in Whitby Jet was one of the most important economic trades at that time with the Romans in England. So it's one of the oldest economic resources in the British Isles, and it used to be an important source of income for that local area. Jet collection requires a lot of patience, as it requires and relies on coastal erosion to free the Whitby Jet from the surrounding kind of rock areas. It's not a, there's no mechanized mining techniques that are used to extract the Whitby Jet, and it's just kind of collected along that coastline area. Whitby Jet is a fossilized driftwood, and the fossilization process, which takes over 180 million years, or a considerable length of time. The trees that were in existence have been subjected to chemical action in stagnant water. So stagnant water means water that has not moved. For example, if you've got a swimming pool at home and you don't attend to it and the water is stagnant and you don't have the pump moving the water around and you don't put the chlorine in it to keep it clean, the stagnant water will turn greenish, it'll start to smell, and then you get things like it turns green with algae, or you can get things like mosquitoes and things. So stagnant water, water that hasn't been circulated or moved around. So the stagnant water chemically acts upon the driftwood, and then the driftwood undergoes changes when it's applied with pressure and when it's in an oxygen-free environment. So it becomes fossilized, and this is what gives it changes the structure, makes it more dense, and gives it that really good luster and really nice shine to it. Whitby jet is always opaque, but if it's cut thin enough, it may be a reddish brown in thin sections, although it's not something that we do for identification to cut it that thin. The hardness is 3 to 4 and the material is considered brittle. So the earring that's going around would have been snapped off from the fitting because it is brittle and it can break easily. It will show a conchoidal fracture, but the material is usually very lustrous and very bright and has a resinous type appearance. The hot point test yields the smell of burning coal. Just for clarity, I've never done a hot point test on any material. So we quoted in the PowerPoint, and again, I've looked at the PowerPoint behind me. We quoted in the material that we teach, but it's not a test that we regularly do. With one distinction, which is not related to this class, but I feel like sharing the story anyway. I bought off eBay, surprise, surprise, some material that was supposed to be dyed treated Chalcedony. And when it turned up, I felt that it wasn't Chalcedony and it was too light and I wasn't quite sure what it was. So we decided to burn it with a Bic lighter and the bloody stuff caught fire. It actually did catch fire and burn. So if you're going through the ornamentals collection and you come across a marquee shaped green, fairly large, maybe about an inch, 25 mil diameter, fairly flat cap, and it's got this brownish part on one end, that's the piece of plastic that was bought as dyed Chalcedony that we set fire to with a Bic lighter in the lab. But other than that piece, there's been no other piece that I've either tried to set alight or done a hot point test on.
And you did it in the fume cupboard, didn't you?
Of course we did. Actually, we did it in the jeweller's room, the other side of the lab. The jewellers were having a day there and I walked in and asked if they could use the oxy torch on it to see if it would light. Anyway, okay, so the next slide, I've got a photo of a pair of carved Whitby jet earrings, which are typical Victorian for the era. It's about 1880s-ish. The fittings are later. They're not the original fittings with the shepherd hook earrings. These are in my private collection, and the Whitby jet is glued into those findings. The Whitby jet can't be drilled. It needs to be glued into the findings. Another thing, Whitby jet may become electrified when it's rubbed against a cloth and may pick up pieces of paper with the static electricity. So that's something you
Pass
can
it back now.
pass it back. So whoever's got a piece of scrap paper, tear it into tiny little pieces.
Now see if it picks up your hair. Not all of it.
Any of the hair attracted to it? Not really?
No.
Okay, so maybe tear up little pieces of paper.
Tissue paper will do.
Do we have any tissues here?
No, next door.
Next door?
If I go in one more time, they'll kill me.
They're not doing a mock exam, are they? No.
Not doing much at all.
So rub it on material. And something woolen would be ideal.
Crazy. You look at
Does it pick up the paper?
oh well, we teach that as well.
Oh well. Okay, jet production was one of the greatest lapidary industries seen in the UK because the material was carved and turned into things like cameos. However, in 1915, there was a magazine similar to something like the Woman's Weekly in Australia. It was called The Lady. It described the Whitby jet trade as somewhat of a funeral fetish and thickly fashion. And it basically killed the trade in Whitby jet and in mourning jewellery from that period on. So it was a distinct generational change. And there was an immediate decline in demand for this material. So the majority of the Whitby jet on the market is pre-1915. The last apprenticed jet worker died in 1958. And as of 2016, there are still 11 jewellery stores or 11 lapidaries set up in Whitby who still manufacture items from Whitby jet. So it is possible to buy Whitby jet items, but it's just a very, very, very small trade now compared to what it was. Melissa, did you have a question? No?
Sorry,
That's okay.
I've only ever heard of it called jet. Is it?
So Whitby just refers to the town where it was found from.
Yeah.
And because the Whitby township had such a large reliance upon that trade, sometimes it just gets called Whitby jet.
But it's all one and the same.
Yes. Yes. Now I said earlier about how brittle jet is. And I also mentioned when there was the picture of my earrings on the screen, for those at home, if you zoom in on that picture, you might be able to see the glue. And I'll just point out here with the cursor for those at home, there's still remnants of the glue from that fitting. So it's glued into the fittings. There are chains that are made of Whitby jet. One of the ways to identify the chain is that they can't be carved into one link of one chain. So they essentially carve individual links, but every second link is going to be cut into half and then reassembled when it's linked back through a full loop and then glued together. So every second link is glued in place. So you'll find the cut lines and the glue lines of that material. That differs from like a manufactured plastic material where you won't find those types of manufacturing techniques. So because Whitby jet has been such an important trade for over 4,000 years, anytime that you have a commodity that is valuable, you have people who try to imitate that commodity or offer similar items at a lower price. So there's always been lots of different materials that have been offered either at a lower price point or trying to deceive and pass off as the genuine article. To be a successful imitant of jet, it needs to be something that is a good visual representation of the jet material. So because jet is so black and because it has a good luster and because it's so lightweight, when you passed around that earring, a few of you mentioned how light it was. So good imitants of jet need to also be lightweight. They need to be black in appearance. They need to be a poor thermal conductor. So because jet is made of wood, it's a poor thermal conductor. That means when you touch it, it's warm to the touch. To be a good imitant, it needs to be cheap. Whitby jet, to carve Whitby jet is a labour-intensive industry that takes hours to carve a single individual item, but mass-produced imitant items need to come in at a cheaper price point, need to be able to be mass-produced to save on that labour component. Bog oak is one material that has been used as an imitant of jet. Bog oak is basically a tree material, but it's not a specific type of tree. It's tree material that has been buried in peat bog for thousands of years. It doesn't get the black colour that jet does, but it can be stained and dyed to make it look more black. It does come out of an environment with extremely low oxygen levels that has protected the wood from decay over those thousands of years. The peat provides an acidic condition where iron salts and other minerals react with tannins within the wood to give it a distinct dark brown to an almost black colour. But bog oak has a very dull luster, and it's always got the wood grain effect present. So you won't see a wood grain in jet, but you'll see a wood grain in bog oak. Particularly when you look at the back of a bog oak piece, you get that texture and that wood grain. Jewellery for bog oak comes mainly from Ireland, from Scottish Ireland, from shamrock jewellery. It was used as a jewellery item in its own right, as well as a simulant of Whitby jet. And you can find items of shamrocks and of harps quite commonly in motifs from Irish crafts around that time. And again, to that 40-year heyday period of the late Victorian era. So from about 1860 to about 1901. Production from the 1800s became popular from about 1852, when technology made it possible for mass production. So the bog oak started to be turned on wood lathes. So you get those tool marks as well on the back of this material. They can also be moulded with the application of a hydronic or heated pressure, and then heated pressure applied to dried wood. So the motifs that they used didn't have to be hand carved. They effectively pressed into the wood. But the wood is often lathed turned first. So we look for concentric rings on the back of the material together with the wood grain structure. So the picture on the screen now is of a couple of pictures of bog oak items that were mass produced for the jewellery market. So they don't quite have the glossy luster that the jet does. And although they may be dark black in appearance, they're not as black as the Whitby jet. Also, this material can be drilled. So you'll find little drill holes in the back to fit fittings onto, whereas the jet, the fittings have to be glued on because the material can't be drilled. Next material we're going to talk about is vulcanite. Vulcanite is a rubber material that was discovered by Charles Goodyear of the Goodyear tire fame. He called the hardened rubber a vulcanized rubber, and he called it vulcanite. It can be produced in any color, but predominantly black vulcanite was produced. It's the most widely used simulant of Whitby jet. So vulcanite is very, very common, but it does disintegrate over the decades. So not a lot of vulcanite jewellery has survived through to the present day because it tends to fall apart. Vulcanite is a thermoset material, which is slightly different to thermoplastic. So I'll talk a little bit more about thermoplastic when we get into the tortoiseshell. Thermoset means that vulcanite cannot be heated and remolded into a different shape, whereas thermoplastics can be heated and remolded. Where they get a little bit bendy. After moulding, the vulcanite sets solid and becomes very brittle. And when rubbed against a piece of material, the vulcanite should smell really strongly of sulfur. So it shouldn't smell really good. It should smell really bad. Kind of like rotten egg smell. Yes. So on the screen, I've got a couple of pictures now of some vulcanite jewelry. When vulcanite gets exposed to light, it starts to turn a little bit greenish and a little bit kind of a weird color. You can also see when you look at the vulcanite jewelry, because it is molded, you'll get mold marks with the motifs and the decorations. Brooch pins are usually screwed into position as well. They're not glued like Whitby Jet. Chains will show one split per link. So the chain is made when it's still setting. They cut the chain and then they bend it, kind of like when we're making jump rings. The jump rings are bent, threaded through, and then you bend the jump ring back into place. Does that kind of, for people who handle jump rings? So vulcanite, a similar process. They'll make the chain with one split. They bend it, link it through, bend it back while it's still rubbery enough to do that, and then it's set solid. So chain links will show 1 or 2 splits per link depending on style. Something like an anchor link, which is actually, does anyone know what an anchor link is? I'm taking off my necklace. Just so that you can see the style of the link. So an anchor link, each loop, it's got an oval link with a bar down through the center. Yeah. So if you're making that type of link out of vulcanite, you'd need 2 splits because there are 2 holes that need to be linked onto the next, the chain either side. So the link can be twisted open and then closed during the manufacture before, and that's obviously not vulcanite.
What do you mean?
What do you mean? But once the vulcanite has set solid, then it can't be remelted or remolded. And over time, the vulcanite will change color. It goes to kind of a khaki, greenish, brownish type color. So because most of these materials now are antique materials that are over 100 years old, the vulcanite is very easy to distinguish from genuine jet, and the bog oak is easy to distinguish because of the lathe turning and the wood grain effect. Vulcanite pieces were often molded from Whitby Jet originals, so you'll have the same motifs, but because they're molded, you'll see the mold lines in the vulcanites. The Whitby Jet pieces, because of the labour-intensive manufacture and because they're more expensive pieces, you'll have a limited number of pieces with the same motif available to the marketplace, whereas the vulcanite, you'll see a repeated number of materials all with the same motif. So motif means, the same lady's face repeated over and over and over again. So we look for mold marks. We look for a lack of wear because it's harder than jet. It's also, we look for a light heft, so it's lighter than jet as well. The next item we're going to talk about is gutta percha. Gutta percha is something that's found a lot in antique books. I want to say antique books. I haven't actually seen a lot of gutta percha myself in antique auction rooms. In 1843, gutta percha arrived in England. It's a rubber-like substance made from the sap of the Palicquium tree, or the Palicquium gutta, and it's native to Malay and Borneo. It is a thermoplastic material, and it's got a hardness of 1, which could be scratched by a fingernail. Gutta Percha Company was founded in London in 1845 and made a large number of objects for use around the house, not just jewellery. Few pieces of gutta percha have survived as the material becomes brittle when exposed to air. It will smell like rubber when rubbed briskly on fabric, and it will taste like salt if you feel like licking a piece. It does say in the PowerPoint at your own risk. It's kind of like a hot point test, but a little bit more dangerous. We don't necessarily condone licking samples of gemstone materials. Most pieces are misidentified and are actually a different material called shellac. Through the antique auction room, because I collect a little bit of antique jewellery and have been following antique auctions for 20 odd years, I see a lot of jet. I see the occasional bog oak piece. Don't really see any vulcanite come through the auction rooms, and I don't think I've ever seen a piece of gutta percha. However, the books say that most pieces are misidentified and are actually shellac. And I have never seen a piece of jewellery that's been advertised as shellac. So this is kind of not a lot of information on that type of material.
What colour is it? Like, what does it, like, I can't envision it, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the shellac comes from a particular beetle.
Means, isn't it, that they dissolve and they use as a French polish?
Yes, so they dissolve it and can use it as a French polish. They also use the shellac material for holding items, like you can use shellac in lapidary for dopping up gemstone materials. It's kind of got that dark brownish type colour, and it's got a little bit more of a gloss to it.
Nice.
Hardened French polish.
But I don't think I've ever seen any jewellery advertised as shellac.
No, not a shellac.
And I don't think I can recall ever seeing anything advertised as gutta percha. So it's kind of rare type of material. Okay, next item we're going to talk about, pressed horn. In 1712, a gentleman by the name of John O'Bissett discovered that horn could be moulded into various shapes with the application of heat. Fun party trick. The shape retained its shape when the object was cooled again. So this is the definition of what a thermoplastic is. So thermoplastic is a material that can be heated up. It becomes a little bit bendy, so you can bend it into the shape that you want, or you can apply pressure to a mold and you can achieve other more complicated shapes. And when the material cools down, it hardens and it retains that shape, but you can heat it up again at any time and rebend it into another shape. So thermoplastic can be remolded over and over and over again. Pressed horn has a light heft, and a hot point test will smell like burnt hair. Its hardness is 2.5, but it takes a good polish. A sheet of horn can be placed between two hot metal plates in a press and pressure applied. So this will warm the material, and then it takes on board the shape of whatever has been put in the press with it. So you can press it into different shapes and forms.
Sorry, I was reading, what is this, a horn?
So
A horn
yes,
from an animal?
yes.
Oh, okay.
Like a rhino.
Rhino horn, cow, deer horn, cow horn.
Oh, okay. 'Cause I was reading through it. Oh, I was reading through it and I was trying to figure out, like, yeah, what's that main thing?
So these are all still in the types of jet.
Of jet, yes. Yeah. So the horn can be dyed black, but the colour will be uneven because of its fibrous structure. It will delaminate because it's got a layered structure. So delaminate means to come apart in sheets and layers. And a loop will be able to identify the layered structures. And the fittings with pressed horn will usually be screwed into place.
And you never, ever, ever get that with your jet. It's always glued.
It's always glued with jet.
So that's like a really quick, easy way to just go straight.
Yes,
What actually happens if you try to drill into jets? Just crack.
it'll crack. because it's so brittle. So the next slide has got a couple of pictures of jewellery made from pressed horn. Again, jewellery items that are fairly typical for the period of that heyday of late Victorian jewellery from about the 1860s to the 1900s. A hand holding a sheaf of wheat, some various other kind of tokens. One pendant there that's got possibly on porcelain, sometimes even on ivory. The miniatures, the paintings on the ivory, because we didn't have cameras to be able to take photos. So the wealthy would have miniatures painted of their dear loved ones, and either on a porcelain or on an ivory. Shellac. Shellac is a resin secreted by the female lac bug on trees in the forests of India and Thailand. It's sold as dry flakes and dissolved in ethanol to make a liquid shellac. It's a natural bioadhesive polymer and chemically similar to synthetic polymers, and it's dark brown but can be blackened.
Is that connected to what they put on nails?
No, it's not connected to the shellac that we put on nails. So there's a couple of pictures of some shellac items. All of these pictures were taken from the one article that I think was a Maggie Campbell Pedersen article.
Yeah, she comes up.
I've just momentarily almost forgotten the lady's name again. So yeah, so that's shellac. I think French jet is the last item that we're going to talk about with the jet imitants. So we're coming now to talk about glass. So we find glass in a number of different aspects of jewellery items and objects. Because glass can be moulded, it can adopt any shape that we want it to. So we can make moulds of something like a cameo and pour the glass into the mould, and then we get a moulded glass cameo. If we colour it black, then we get the luster of the glass. So it's a very lustrous material with a vitreous luster. And we get any shape object that we want. We also get a lot of beads made out of French jet. So with the beads, they're very rarely faceted. They're mostly going to be moulded. So we're going to see the mould lines with the beads and mould lines, and
You don't want concave facets on French
No,
jet.
we don't
because
want
they're not. They're
concave
actually
facets.
rounded facets on
they're
French
rounded
jet.
facets. But I'm thinking about, I'll come to the word in a minute. Probably just mould marks that
Mould
I'm
marks.
thinking of. Yeah, mould.
Rounded facets, mold marks.
Yeah, you get the seam. The seam
Oh,
is
yeah.
what I was thinking of. The seam.
Mold mark.
And vitreous luster.
Mm.
So we get beads, but we can also get any other item that can be moulded out of glass. If the jet is translucent enough to light, then we will also be able to see something like flow lines or swirls, and occasionally gas bubbles as well. Now we're going to start on tortoiseshell. Yeah, let's start on tortoiseshell. I think I was going to get to the start of shell tonight. I think was where I was wanting
Well,
to
you've
get
only
to.
got coral and amber next week.
Yeah, but I had 163 slides. So I was trying to divide it into roughly 80 and 80, which I think took me up to the beginning of shell. So we'll start on tortoiseshell.
That one up.
Hawksbill tortoise. So tortoiseshell is another item that is strictly regulated and is not currently able to be bought. It's kind of like ivory. However, you can still get a large amount of tortoiseshell on the second-hand market and through auction rooms. I want to say it's possibly easier to obtain than the ivory. But tortoiseshell is more likely to be used in other decorative type of objects and things such as hair combs. So the image that I have on the screen at the moment is a very decorative large hair comb that a lady would put the hair up into a bun, and the tortoiseshell comb would sit up so that the tortoiseshell would sit up at the back. Other items that have been made out of tortoiseshell, we have things such as tea caddies and other forms of useful everyday objects around the house. In terms of jewellery, there's a antique style of jewellery that's called piqué. Tortoiseshell is a thermoplastic, so it can be moulded when it's heated up. So objects, they heat up the tortoiseshell and then they can bend it into the shape that they want. While it's warm, they can inlay other metals into the surface of the tortoiseshell. So piqué is a style of jewellery where gold and silver leaf has been pressed into the surface of the tortoiseshell to make decorative patterns. And you get a lot of pendants made out of this style of jewellery and a lot of earrings and pendants, but not a lot of rings out of piqué. Tortoiseshell comes from the plates covering the hawksbill turtle. So it's not actually a tortoise, and it's found in most tropical and subtropical seas. The shell itself, the plates, consist of keratin, which is a fibrous protein similar to that forming horns and hooves of cattle and similar to human fingernails. Tortoiseshell is yellow in colour, but it's always got these spots of reddish and chestnut brown patches. There's a lot of imitants of tortoiseshell on the market, the most common being a plastic imitant, where they also put in different colours in little kind of dots and splotches to imitate the pattern that we see in the tortoiseshells. Genuine tortoiseshell, however, those patches of brown from the melanin, they form little aggregates. So when you look at it under magnification, you see a very kind of dotted, speckled appearance of little dots of brown. Whereas the plastic, you don't get those little dots. You get a very smooth kind of flow line of the brown coloration. So with the hand lens, we look for those small aggregates. They're really, really noticeable under low levels of magnification. So the tortoiseshell is a thermoplastic. So any shape can be obtained by applying a low heat and a slight amount of pressure. We've got one piece of tortoiseshell in the collection that was donated by a past teacher who's now passed away. And she just picked it up at an op shop. That's what I was looking for, as an op shop. But being a jeweler, she applied heat to it and she kind of straightened it out, and then she remolded it to fit her wrist, and she kind of played around with it. So the piece that we have in the lab next door has been, she used to demonstrate it to class of how to heat it up and how to straighten it out. So it can be easily molded into different shapes. Once it cools, it will retain its shape, but it just takes a small amount of heat to be able to make it bendy again. A hot point test will have a distinctive smell of burnt hair. But as I said previously, I've never done a hot point test on anything other than that piece of plastic that I bought as chrysoprase.
Have you ever burnt your head?
Yeah, I have burnt my hair. Yeah. UV, the yellowish sections should fluoresce a bluish white, whereas the chestnut sections shouldn't fluoresce. But we don't really do the UV test for identification purposes because it's so typical with the hand lens, looking for those little dots of melanin. Hardness is 2.5, SG 1.3, spot RI 1.55, but we're not going to do any refractive index test on it. Luster is greasy to waxy to resinous, and the fracture will be uneven to splintery. And then what's on the screen at the moment is a pair of antique piqué earrings, again from maybe around 1860s to 1880s. And the piqué is made by laying in gold and silver into the tortoise shell. So some of these objects can be really quite beautiful in how they've been constructed, and they're very collectible. And there's not as much restrictions on the sale of antique tortoiseshell as there is on the sale of antique ivory. But those piqué earrings, so those type of piqué jewelry items are very rare. They don't come to the market that frequently. Imitations of tortoiseshell, we've got the plastic, and with the hand lens, there's no aggregates in the plastic, so no dot-like structure. And with the hot point test, the plastic smells like burning milk, apparently. And then we're on to shell. So I'm going to leave it as shell and come back next week, because there's a lot with the shell of the different types of shell, and then the structures of the shell and the flame-like pattern, striations in the shell, and then the different types of shell, and the mother of pearl shell and the helmet shell, and then we're into corals. Shell, 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 and coral. So apologies again to those who were in the room.
What's that?
Yeah. Good. And hopefully, yeah, David will work it out tomorrow. Hopefully David will work it out tomorrow. And if David doesn't work it out, Tim will work it out tomorrow. In fact, let's just say Tim will work it out tomorrow.